Welcome to the panel on putting equity into action, what California must do. And just going to introduce very quickly the panel. And these are people who are really working in the trenches at various levels of education practice in California. And so the goal is really to get their thoughts on what getting down to facts means for them. Jorge Aguilar is Superintendent of Sacramento City Unified School District. Next to him, Lynn Rocha Salazar, who's principal of the Air Elementary School District, Air Elementary School in Fresno. Next to him, Glenn Price, who is the Chief Deputy Superintendent of Public Instruction at CDE. Arun Ramanathan, who is CEO of Pivot Learning. And last but not least, Valerie Cuevas, who is president of the West Contra Costa County Unified School District and also a senior program officer at the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. So just a word about myself. I actually grew up in South Africa. I was privileged to see the end of apartheid there and actually watched Nelson Mandela cast his first vote in 1994. And you all know the history of South Africa, made some progress there, still a lot of segregation, and apartheid is being dismantled slowly. But really, we should be further ahead in California on some of these measures. Too much segregation in our schools, achievement gaps too wide, and one of the main goals of this getting down to facts is to really try to really address this issue. How can we narrow and hopefully close these achievement gaps in our own lifetimes? So I'm just going to start. I thought let's start at the school level. Lynn Rocha Salazar, you are having to deal with this issue every day. Kids coming into your school, and I know this is something that you are committed to, but how does this look to you from a school level? Do you feel that it's possible for you to narrow these achievement gaps with the tools and resources that you have at your disposal? Let's get the...
Well, in the words of Seth Godin, dissatisfaction is fuel.
Closer, let's get the...
In the words of Seth Godin, dissatisfaction is fuel. And so I've been a site leader for 12 years, and the achievement gap is something that we've struggled with continuously. And so this new work around continuous improvement has really been a game changer for me personally. And I think it's really what has kept me at the site level and this opportunity to achieve or address these issues as a systems thinker and to get at the work in a very different way.
So let me ask you, though, you've been in Fresno for 29 years. We talked earlier, you've been principal for 11 years. How does this discussion, when you hear all this research, does this seem relevant to you?
It can be when you start to look at it in a broader context, which is somewhat new to me. It's really about being boots on the ground. So when we hear about the need for additional funding or less adults on a school site, it really resonates with me, and that in order to embrace continuous improvement or to implement the principles of improvement science, one example might be the need for an additional staff member in order to go deeply in the work. And sometimes that might be misunderstood by a district or a system. And I'm having to also reframe my thinking in that it's not that people aren't willing to help, but they might not have the knowledge, the background, or experience to understand why the structure needs to be changed. And so I think the biggest advantage for us in our journey last year, and beginning with issues of equity and access and support of African American students in the area of math, was that as we went through the implementation of the principles of improvement science, that the teachers were able to recognize the root cause as their level of efficacy in math, the delivery of math instruction, which was not about laying blame, but just taking responsibility and with all humility recognizing that they needed further professional development in order to address that achievement gap and those issues. And so therefore, how do I go about as the leader of the school to provide them with the professional development they need in a system that may be well stretched in meeting that ability to meet them where they're at?
I'm going to go to Jorge Aguilar next, but we're going up the ladder. But before I let Lynn go, one of the key findings of the paper by Sean Reardon was that kids are coming to school with a huge gap at kindergarten, grade level gap, not only for low income kids, for middle income kids. How are you dealing with that at your school?
Well, one of the things that this improvement journey has led me to was to look outside of not only my system, but my district. And so I looked at two local universities, Fresno State and Fresno Pacific, who both pointed me to Ames, which has been involved in the research of the mathematics of children. And what some of the research is starting to indicate is that the problem we're having with math is that we continue to look at it through the lens of the adult and not the student. So we recognize that students have understandings of mathematics, and so how can we work with our teachers to make professional noticings that will really drive their instruction and their next steps? So I share that with you in that although they may come behind, right, that I think there's still more work to be done with what they do know in order to tap into what they know and teaching them what they need to learn next. And so it's really that positive presupposition, recognizing that all students bring something to the table and that those issues are areas in which we can have impact at the site level.
Okay, I'm going to now go to Jorge Aguilar. And many of you have been reading the papers. Sacramento City is facing a big budget shortfall, like quite a few urban districts in the state. And I'm just wondering, Superintendent Aguilar, what does this mean for you in terms of implementing an equity gender agenda? Do you feel you're able to move forward on that, or do you feel your hands are tied?
Well, I would extend I'd extend the question beyond what it means to me to more appropriately be, what does it mean to this community? And let me kind of give you a sense of that. The irony is that as we thought about advancing equity, access, and social justice in Sac City, what we've actually done for the past year and 2-3 months is we've advanced equality more than equity. And that was done with intention. I saw Matt Navo earlier, former superintendent in Sanger Unified, where my kids were enrolled up until last year. And this is a true story. I've said it here and there, so I'll mention it here. I have twin boys who, when I was offered the position in Sac City, were really upset that we were going to be leaving Sanger because they were about to enter 5th grade. And in 5th grade, you can play tackle football in Sanger Unified. And I sat them down and said, listen, Joaquin and Javier, you'll play tackle football in Sac City, so nothing will be lost. They said, okay, all right. So get to Sac City and come to realize that we had no elementary sports programs throughout the entire city. And began to get flyers, $90 for an 8-week basketball program every Thursday, not resulting in coordinated sports, just playing basketball after school. And we decided, not because, of course, my twin boys, but we decided to launch some very inexpensive initiatives to close opportunity gaps, to say to our community, extracurricular activities, the engagement in sports, arts, etc., will help our students reach grade level proficiency. We then followed that up with another equality-based initiative, which was to offer the SAT, then the PSAT, to pay for the AP test for every one of our students. Last year, we had 1,300 tests that went untested from students that had taken an AP course. We had about 600 students starting their senior year who had an SAT score, and that was it. That's about 25% of our students. So offered the SAT, and it went up to about 90% or so. We did a summer program for students as early as kindergarten who were not demonstrating grade level proficiency before they started in first grade, second graders before they started in third grade, sixth graders before they started in seventh grade, eighth graders before they started in ninth grade. And I can go on and on, right? So it was for all students, only to learn as I was getting a sense of our budgeting philosophy that all of those initiatives cost us about $4 million, that all of it was contributing to the deficit, right, that we have today. And so the question is, what does it mean to a community that we are trying to advance the idea of closing and offering opportunities for students, and yet you're contributing to a deficit? Well, it can only mean one of two things, in my opinion. That we have a budgeting philosophy that puts more attention to the needs of students or to the needs of adults. And there lies the difficulty of my work today, is what are the actions that we take given where we can assess the needle stands between those 2 points. And of course, I am not ready to apologize that we've contributed to the deficit in light of the very tangible opportunities that we've offered students throughout Sac City in the past year and a half. But what we do from here on is of course the difficult question, and one that I think goes beyond the walls of any of our 77 schools and an entire school district, and more is a question that we have to ask: where do we stand as a community with respect to what we think is equity, access, and social justice?
I'm going to now, thank you, Jorge Aguilar. I'm going to go to Valerie Cuevas. You're on the school board, also having to make some of these very tough decisions. Let me just ask you, Valerie, are there any things that you are doing, also facing some challenging budget issues, that you feel you're excited about, that you think are making a difference, despite the budget crunch, which may get even worse because of Governor Brown's recession that he's been predicting for many years?
Right. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So I think to sum up why I'm sitting on this table is because be careful what you ask for, you might get it. I started off as an ed advocate for a number of years, and then I ran for school board.
Can people hear in the back?
And now I'm making tough choices and decisions about how do we provide quality educational opportunities for all students. And with that comes all the responsibility of being able to deliver what it is that you've advocated for your whole life. And knowing that there are challenges in relation to doing that, and doing that in the context of now being an elected official and at the local level. There was an equity conversation earlier and eloquently stated by Chris Edley about what the possibilities are for solving problems at the local level and what the limitations are. And I'm learning that every day. But in West Contra Costa Unified, we have about 29,000 students. 75% of them are considered unduplicated students. Majority are low-income English learners, foster youth. I only have $353 million, and I say only in terms of my annual budget from the state in order to address the needs of kids that we discussed earlier are high need. And so I'm often confronted with the notion of even how we frame the question. Kids are coming, and even how I do it, and challenge myself constantly and change my paradigm. Kids are coming with a huge gap. And I needed to start thinking about, in this role, shifting that to say California is coming as the 4th largest economy in the world. And starting from that point, because the deficit notion of the gap's going to be there is always going to be part of the equation. But the solution for me has got to be in looking at what's possible, what's available. I grew up pretty humble. I'm the oldest of 6 kids. My mother was 16, my father was 17 when I was born. And my life is kind of framed by being the MacGyver of the family. When you didn't have something, you found a way to build it. You found a way to imagine it. You found a way to get your need met with what you had. So that's my orientation as a school board member, but I know that the papers that were released really helped frame for me in context what is key pieces of information, and that is that I know and I truly believe that what happens in the classroom, the magic that happens, the learning possibility between students and teachers is still for me a priority no matter what. And so what we've been doing in our district is we've had to make clear choices about how do we support that, knowing that there are multiple needs as a school board member now. I mean, I'm talking multiple needs, from not just how do I pay teachers, how do I make that magic happen, but how do I keep kids safe so that somebody doesn't show up and hurt them? And how do you prioritize the choices you're making in that gamut? And how do I also address the needs of their social emotional learning needs? And so these papers are really interesting to me because I still want to come back on the notion of what were some of the things that were said around. What do the adults need to come to the equation with to help kids be successful? And one of the papers in particular talked about 5 basic assets that our educators need to come just right out the door. When you show up, you need to have these things. One was basic knowledge and skills in general around content knowledge, integrated teaching practices, knowledge of English language development, and awareness around literacy development. And for me, when I think about that kid that's a MacGyver trying to figure out how do I solve this problem with what I have to go back to what are those basic core things that are going to help me create. And I think that's what this paper talks about, in particular around the work around the professional development and the role that we have for our educators. So that's been key for me, and I think that's what we've been focusing on our district, is what are the ways we're going to support that, and it's going to come at a cost. Mm-hmm. And God forbid it comes at the cost of somebody saying, you didn't support my student's safety enough. Because that's my biggest fear about being a school board member right now.
I'm going to jump, thank you, Valerie Cuevas. I'm going to jump to Arun, Pivot Learning, working with districts all around the state. Arun, I just wanted to ask you, and you've been very involved with LCF ever since it was proposed. To what extent do you think LCFF, Local Control Funding Formula, we try now to use the acronyms at EdSource, should be or could be reformed to include more of an equity agenda? Although, of course, it does focus on low-income kids, so that is clearly a part of it, but we are still seeing these achievement gaps.
Yeah. Can you all hear me? Well, I mean, you know, a lot of education conferences are really depressing. And, you know, I think you got to get, as a start, to strike the balance between the positive on one side, right, and then the negative on the other side. And when I look at these getting down to facts papers, they do paint a lot of positive on the side of equity, right? So, you know, I'm going to recommend some differences and changes, Dr. Kirst, but, you know, fully acknowledging the magnitude of the achievement by a lot of folks in this room, not just Dr. Kirst, to push LCFF forward, to make it a reality, and to ensure that money started flowing towards need, right? And that, in California, has made a tremendous difference. But there's also been around the nation different states looking to California and saying, okay, well, they did this, and God, look at them. We could do this too, right? So that, I think that is an incredibly positive thing. There are also positives in relation to the state's focus and shift around standards and the standards implementation. Granted, we still have a little while to see that in terms of our student outcomes. We have major gaps. But I think we do have to acknowledge some of the positivity. And by the way, I'm not normally a hugely positive human being, so I'm being really positive here. Some of the positivity that emerged from these last 8 years. Now, with that said, I would say also, every now and then a big federal law goes through a reauthorization. What's that on a 5 to 7 year timeline? Some like IDA may take like 20 years because nobody wants to touch it, right? But every now and then, you go through these reauthorizations. And I would say there are several different things that for LCFF you do have to think about in terms of change in order to promote more equity. And I'll just be really quick with several of them. One is I think you need to get rid of the LCAP. I think the LCAP, I've read many of them. I've printed out many of them. I now use them to light fires in my fireplace. They are massively long. They're monumentally useless. Nobody can access them, and they're a waste of time by good people who might be doing different things if you gave them a different way to do that. You still have districts around the state who are doing LCAPs in the strategic plans. Let the districts do their strategic plans and find a different way to figure out accountability for money. The second piece I would argue is the state has done a poor job of linking its other major initiatives like MTSS to something quite as simple as improving outcomes for high-need students. The point of the MTSS model is that
MTSS is the
multi-tiered systems of support, is that it's supposed to identify the supports and services that you're giving to high-need students. Let districts come up with their MTSS models in collaboration with their community that gives them a very specific thing to do, and then align the resources to that and let that be their LCAP. Lastly, I would say if you really want to know where money goes, you might not actually want to know where money goes, by the way. If you really want to know where money goes, then start looking at it from an accounting level and start deciding how you're going to shift California's accounting system so you know what's going to the school level and what's going to the district level. Every year there's a negotiation in school districts, the same fight comes up. When there's a next downturn, the same fight will come up. Just shift those accounting codes so you can see that actual flow of money. Let that be the transparency that you're looking for. I say that those are the big things on that side, on the LCAP and accountability side. On the student side, the other big thing I see is that California is still to this date not focusing on concentrated poverty, right? We think that we're focusing on concentrated poverty through the concentration grant, but we're not actually. And I'm wondering and again, this is kind of just thinking about this, whether the unit of change should appropriately be the district or the school for something like a concentration grant. Our problem is that we don't have enough staff in our schools. It's been the same way since I was a teacher in 1998 in San Francisco Unified. So where should that money flow to result in the most staff, and at what level do you have that concentration threshold? And then lastly, we have to look at unduplicated is a really horrible way to refer to kids. Could we just stop referring to kids, high-need kids, as unduplicated and start referring to them as foster youth, English learners, low-income kids, and we also have concentrations of homeless and foster youth and other students of very high need in districts, particularly in the districts where we're working. In Monterey Peninsula, where there's 3 times as many homeless kids as there are in San Francisco Unified. Antelope Valley, where there are almost all the foster kids for LA County. We've got to start looking at concentrations of poverty differently. And so I would suggest these are ways that we need to start thinking about tweaking the model. I've also got stuff about the whole dashboard, but I won't say anything yet.
Okay. Okay, well, abolishing the LCAP. We've just spent a lot of energy establishing it, so not sure how that would be received. But let me go to Glenn Price. Glenn, your big picture, California Department of Education, 10,000 schools, 1,000 school districts. Getting down to facts, identified some issues around CDE in terms of capacity. What do you see as what CDE could be doing around the supporting school districts to tackle the issues that everyone has talked about?
Great. Well, thanks, Louis, and thanks for having me here today. And just major congratulations to all the researchers and the whole community that put down this incredible Getting Down to Facts reports. Can I just see by a show of hands, how many people in this room have read all of the reports? Heather's one, okay.
Okay, we have special prizes for those people.
4 or 5. I say that because I heard a rumor, and I didn't glance over to my left here, that Arun, you've read all of them?
skimmed all of them.
Skimmed all of them.
Yeah,
Okay.
that doesn't count.
I think Arun deserves a round of applause for that, making that happen. So speaking of reports, a couple weeks ago, in addition to reading my Getting Down to Facts reports, I was really intrigued by the publication by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of their climate change report. And I just seen this report come out, media really paying huge attention to it, and maybe it's starting to stimulate, hopefully, some action. Well, we kind of know what those actions would be. And what was the main recommendation of that report? We need to cut carbon pollution as much as possible, as fast as possible. So pretty obvious. And I feel like in some ways, as in response to your question, Louis, and as we move forward, one of the great things about the Getting Down to Facts report is that it reaffirmed in many ways some things that we already know in places that we know that we need to get to. In relation to your question about CDE, someone could have asked me, do I believe that CDE salary structures are competitive enough to retain high-quality staff? And I could have told you for a cup of coffee, no, they're not. So we got some good stuff to work with, and I feel like we're actually in that kind of climate change moment where these reports and the work that we're doing together and the work that we've done over the last 8 to 10 years have really brought us to a place where we can start to answer and most appropriately respond to some of the questions about where we're going. And I feel like as far as this transitional moment, we need to transition from a getting down to facts to a getting down to how are we going to together, all of us, create the conditions for equity in our state. And that's what some of my fellow panelists have been alluding to. And I think from the CDE and from the system perspective, we need to start thinking about what are some of those basic conditions, and some of them were unaddressed in the Getting Down to Facts reports that we need to pay attention to together in order to create that kind of change. And when I do walk around in the state of California and I talk to superintendents and principals and school board members, some of the things that I hear first are around issues are things, very basic things like governance in a school district. How do we support our boards of education to be providing the kinds of governance our districts need in the 21st century? Labor management relations is another area where we know that without positive labor management relations, we're not going to be moving our school districts forward and not going to have those basic conditions in order to create equity. I would expand further on Arun's point and some of the points that were made earlier that, in addition to school districts attacking concentrated poverty, we really need to be thinking about how are we coming together in our communities to create the kinds of alliances between multiple kinds of agencies and partners to really attack those root conditions of poverty, because school districts alone are not going to be able to do that. Some of the great work that's been going on with community schools in the state of California and other ways that we're trying to attack some of these issues. So in terms of the California Department of Education, we've really been on an improvement journey at the Department of Education where we've been trying to figure out how do we wrench ourselves out of the No Child Left Behind era, how do we wrench ourselves out of the Public School Accountability Act and move into a place where we can be providing the kind of support that's needed in the LCFF era. And the way that that's going to go, and I think the way that we need to define that together, is really take a look at what is the kind of State Department that we need in the state that will allow us to provide those kinds of supports, and let that form follow the function of what those kinds of supports might be, because it's going to be totally different than what we've seen before. So I would look towards our State Department continuing to collaborate effectively with the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, with the State Board of Education, and with multiple state agency partners in order to provide that kind of support that's going to create those basic conditions for equity.
Okay, thank you, Glenn Price. And I'm told that we're running out of time, so I'm going to try to just do one quick 1 minute from each of you. If there was one thing that you would like to be able to do in your districts or the districts you're working with that you really think would make a difference in closing the achievement gap and building on the progress that we have made and which has been documented in the Getting Down to Facts report. What would that be? And I'm just going to, Val, you want to jump in 1 minute?
More money. No, I'm just
More
kidding.
money.
No, I think the most important thing is to lead with kids. Remember my lens of you got to work with what you had when I was younger. That's how you created something and made change. And when I think about the positive, because it is about lots of heartbreak in many ways when you're not able to meet needs that are coming to you every day, is what the work means in terms of the impact for kids. When we get it right, then you can't stop me from smiling, because that's the hope of the promise. And so when I think about what I would definitely want to change is, again, how do we take a better review of what are the needs of our students today, right now, and what are the ways then I'm taking the content of what's in front of me to build this better system and figuring out how do I then adjust those needs, not adjust those needs, but what's in front of me to build that system to meet those needs. And I think in many ways we're still trying to take old relics and meet kids' needs in ways that aren't relevant anymore.
I'm going to jump to this end. Jorge Aguilar.
Sure, thank you. I would say that's a complicated question, of course, but I think in the immediate for me, it's to try to figure out a way in which we can upend a budgeting structure that has students front and center, and that what we do when we budget is not done mechanistically, and that when we talk about continuous improvement, that we let go of the mechanistic piece of following a protocol, move away from a prove mindset to an improve mindset. And that we stop trying to think about scaling programs as if it were only about numbers as opposed to about shifting mindsets.
Shifting mindsets. Lynn Rocha Salazar from Air Elementary School. If there was one thing that you would really like to be doing at your school, or maybe you're already doing it, but that you think will make a difference?
I'd really like to continue on with what we've just started. So much like Arun said about not always being positive, having been in the trenches and boots on the ground for 28 plus years and as a site leader for 12, it's been incredibly difficult. And yet the work around improvement science and the results in the increase of teacher agency has just been incredibly powerful for me and really actually keeps me in the game. So we briefly had a conversation about leaving versus leading, right? So I've determined that I would continue to lead in this new environment. And I'm very hopeful that it's going to create different conditions on behalf of our students and that we really can make that difference. And so we have a tendency to jump around in our system from one initiative to another, and I'm in it long enough that I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And so like I've said to our own district leaders, that whatever it's going to be around improvement on behalf of our kids related to issues of equity, because I think we've now been afforded an opportunity and a framework to work very differently.
Arun?
Yeah, I think we could do a lot with the resources that we have, particularly if we start focusing particularly on providing kids, especially kids of color, with grade level assignments. The EdTrust West, EdTrust nationally, TNTP just released a report called The Opportunity Myth, and shows how often we give kids of color assignments that are below their grade level and the negative impact of that. I would say that just doing different, work around that differently statewide, providing teachers with the professional development and principles will have a huge impact. And then secondly, I would approach every day, like my wife does as a kindergarten teacher, with the optimism of a kindergarten teacher, knowing that you're going to see those wonderful kids in a few minutes.
Okay, Glenn Price, viewer education czar for a day. What would you decree?
Well, I would implement everything that my colleagues propose, which would be completely awesome. But I would just add on two things from a system perspective. One is I think as a state, we really need to double down on our commitment to whole child. And that means treating, and President Cuevas, this goes to your emphasis on school safety, it would be treating some of the other indicators that aren't state indicators in our accountability system as having equal weight to our journey away from worshiping at the altar of test scores as our kind of primary means of accountability. So really focusing in on and finding a way that we can move that whole child agenda. The second piece, and maybe to double down a little bit on Arun's proposal around the LCAP, although I'm not sure I share that completely, would be to figure out a way that we can be doing integrated financial planning and strategic planning at the district level. And that, to me, means a pretty substantial revamp of AB 1200 and the way that we're segmenting out some AB 1200 responsibilities, which are really mired in a previous era pre-LCFF model of looking at school accountability. So bring those together.
Well, thank you so much. I knew we would just be able to scratch the surface, but really appreciate all your great insights. We're going to go to the next panel headed by my colleague, John Fenswell, but could we just get a round of applause for this terrific group of people and their work.